I thought the sound of a kitchen at full flame would drown out any loneliness, that clatter of pans like cymbals, burners breathing, blue knives tapping a metronome against cutting boards. But a quiet I had never met before found me there on opening night and took the last chair at the corner table. I am Juliet Martin, 34 years old, a chef who learned to read the faces of onions before I understood my own reflection. I built this restaurant with my hands and savings, and a hunger that wasn't about food, not really. From the moment I signed the lease, hands shaking keys, biting crescents into my palm, I imagined a room full of people I loved, wrapped in the smell of roasted garlic and lemons blistered over flame. I imagined my mother's laugh rising above the warm noise, my father's proud nod from the bar, my brother Ezra lifting a glass and for once toasting me. I imagined being seen. By noon that day, sunlight pooled like melted butter across the tile, and I moved through the kitchen the way swimmers move through water that knows their name. My sous chef, Mina, steeped saffron until the pot exhaled a golden sigh. We marinated lamb with rosemary that still smelled of the hillside it came from. I tasted every sauce, closing my eyes after each spoonful to picture the person it was meant for. That is how I cook for specific faces, specific histories. Food is my way of loving in sentences longer than speech. At 4, the first delivery of flowers arrived, tightly wound white peonies, a note that said, "Break a leg," in neat block letters with no signature. At 5, two of the servers cried quietly in the office over the staff meal, overwhelmed by the certainty of being part of something made with real care. At 6, a line formed. Strangers pressed their palms to the glass to peer in at the soft light, the shelves of preserved lemons gleaming like suns in jars. I checked the door every few minutes for a familiar silhouette. It's a tender, foolish thing to wait for a shape you've been trying to outrun. I grew up as a second course in a house that only advertised its main. Ezra was our parents' miracle, delivered with a halo of expectations and a future that arrived early and stayed. He shone. I learned how to set the table so his light could find its best angle. When I chose culinary school over business school, my mother pursed her lips like she had tasted a lemon that refused to be sweet. "It's a hobby," she said once, flicking crumbs from a counter I had just scrubbed. "You're a hobby." I hid the sting of that sentence under stacks of recipe cards and part-time jobs at places that smelled like possibility. In group photos, I was often the only one holding something: books, plates, jackets, whatever needed carrying so someone else's hands would be free to gesture. At 7, my first guests were seated and I touched the back of each chair lightly as if blessing them. People always gasp at the first spoon of the fennel soup, shocked that something pale can be this full of voice. A table of young women in floral dresses ordered the braised beans with burnt orange and thyme, and then the roast chicken I trust the way my grandmother taught me, firm, forgiving, tied in a way that invites surrender. I sent out the scallop crudo on plates the color of calm, the slices fanned like a soft confession. In the kitchen, we moved as one body, spanning many hands, adjusting, cleaning, listening, hearts beating toward the same bell. Where were they? That question, whispered without breath, found a seat next to me every time I slipped from the line to scan the room. I checked my phone at 7:18, 7:29, 7:41. A text arrived from Ezra's girlfriend Natalie with a photo of a crowded bar lit with cold light. He got the promotion. "We're celebrating at St. Kilda's. Your family says congratulations." There they were, my father's jaw clenched in triumph, my mother's hair perfect in a mirror that didn't reflect me. Ezra with his tie undone just enough to say he'd been chosen again by a world that loves anointed sons. Behind them, someone held up a champagne bottle like a trophy. I could almost hear my mother's voice, that slack, practiced affection, reserved for my news when it didn't outshine his, "We'll make it next time, Juliet. Tonight is important." I put my phone face down and breathed into the burn that bloomed behind my ribs. Mina glanced at me and then at the tickets printing in a steady ribbon of demand. She knew not to ask. I smeared harissa onto the lamb with a gentleness that felt like grief made edible. In the dining room, a couple reached for hands across the table and pressed their knuckles to their lips after the first bite of the chicken, as if to keep relief from escaping. A man at the bar asked the bartender if the preserved lemons were for sale. The bartender shrugged toward me. I shook my head with a smile and wore his apology like a coat against a draft. At 8, my aunt texted a string of exclamation points and a photo of Ezra blowing out candles at a cake that said, "To the VP" in blue icing with a star in the peas hole. At 8:12, my mother posted an Instagram story of a martini captioned, "Proud of my boy." I recognized the ring on her finger, the one she had promised me someday. I looked at the tickets. Perch table 12. Beans table 5. Chicken table 2. The printer purred. The pans hissed. Does a room count as full if the emptiest chairs live inside your chest? It is a peculiar thing to realize you have built a room where you cannot be a daughter. I kept cooking. When the first critic I had invited came in thin scarf eyes like scales, I sent out a dish, not on the menu. The way you write a poem you hope finds only one reader. Seared figs, smoky yogurt, pistachio dust, a syrup made from the sweetest part of burnt orange zest. He closed his eyes after his first bite. The server came back with a soft, urgent voice. He asked who made that. "We did," I said, and this time my own voice steadied. Some nights believing in we is the only way I doesn't break. At 8:39, I excused myself to the alley behind the building and leaned against the cool brick. The night air smelled like a kitchen learning to breathe. Somewhere down the block, a band was warming up in a bar. The bass sounded like a heartbeat coming from someone else's chest. I thought of the years that had brought me here, the burns I wore like a litany on my forearms, the rent I paid by teaching knife skills to people who bought knives as if they could buy the hands to guide them, the tiny studio that smelled like garlic 6 days out of 7 because I cooked to feed my loneliness in courses. I thought of my mother's words returned to me in different outfits over time. "You're sensitive. You're dramatic. You don't understand priorities." The last one was her favorite. I understood priorities. I had been cut by them my whole life. A couple stepped outside to kiss under the alley light, carefree with what it means to love in public. I went back in and arranged muscles into an order that asked the person eating to believe in how salt becomes sweet when it is cooked with patience. At 9, a table of 4 sent back clean plates and asked to see me. I wiped my hands and went out heart ready to be useful. "We just wanted to say thank you," the woman at the head of the table said, touching her chest, and then the rim of her plate as if approach and arrival could be mapped in that small gesture. "We haven't eaten like this since my mother died." There it was, the sentence you cannot rehearse for, but cook toward your entire life. I smiled, nodded, said the tiny words meant to hold back tears in a dining room where all eyes bend toward your steadiness. "Come back," I said, which was true and not a business strategy. At 9:26, Ezra texted, "Proud of you, sis. We'll swing by after dessert." I stared at the words until they separated into their individual letters, unhooked from any reality that could feed me. I typed, deleted, could not figure out how to shape a sentence that didn't re-enlist me into a hierarchy I had outgrown. I sent a single heart and returned to the line. By 10, my family's restaurant, the one where my brother is the entree and I the garnish, was still open 2 neighborhoods away, bright with the drunk confidence of people who don't have to apologize for arriving late. In the kitchen, Mina brushed olive oil over the burnished skin of the last roast chicken and said quietly to no one in particular, "You did it." I nodded, as if courage were something stable, as if it didn't tilt under the pressure of old absences. The dishwasher sang off-key to a song my grandmother used to hum when her hands were busy loving, and her mouth couldn't keep up with the truth. The bartender poured a final glass for a couple who decided not to break up at our bar after all. The critic left a card. The room softened. At 11:15, when the final table pushed back chairs with the exhausted pleasure of the well-fed, I locked the door and turned the sign to closed. I stood alone in the dining room and listened to the building cool the way wood sighs when it realizes it has done its work. I thought I might cry then in that very specific flavor of grief that tastes like salt and victory. Instead, I walked table to table and straightened the silverware by habit, a ritual meant to remind the room that care remains after applause leaves. Ezra never came. None of them did. My mother uploaded a second story from the after-party. The caption an echo of her favorite refrain, "Family first." I laughed once, a small, surprised sound that felt like a knife making its own joke. Then I sat at the corner table, the one I had saved for them, and no one else, and ate a plate of beans that had held the whole day inside them. Slowly, carefully tasting each note, I let the truth settle next to me. I had built a dream, and they had chosen not to walk into it. That, too, was a form of clarity. But clarity is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of knowing exactly where to place your hands when you push back. In the days that followed, their excuses came packaged as etiquette. We couldn't hear ourselves think in that tiny room. You know, Ezra's promotion happens once your restaurant can last. It hurt that you didn't come to his party. I didn't argue. I listened the way you listen for a bone to snap clean. Then I did what I have always done when love won't set a place for me at its table. I returned to the stove, to the knife, to the slow, stubborn work of feeding those who show up. Still, the quiet at that corner table wouldn't let me sleep. It is a hungry thing, emptiness, and it eats at you until you decide whether to feed it or starve it out. I lay awake and made a promise I had never dared before: if my family could not recognize me at my brightest, they would not be allowed to dim me at all. I would set a boundary so clean and sharp, it would gleam when the light hit it. I would turn the room I had built into a sanctuary, and that means I would close the doors on those who insist on arriving, only to rearrange the furniture. The next morning, I brewed coffee strong enough to hold my resolve and wrote an email with a subject line that made my hands shake: house rules. I wrote that the restaurant is not a stage for familial competition, that any guest who disrespects the staff or attempts to hijack the evening will be refused service, and that includes members of my own family. I sent it to the staff first. Then I drafted another one to the people who share my last name. You're welcome here if you arrive with respect. If you arrive with control, you will be asked to leave. I hovered over send. Then I pressed the key. What I didn't know as the email left my outbox like a small ship into weather, I couldn't predict, was that the sea beyond the horizon was already rough. Ezra, in the glow of his new title, would feel my boundary as an insult. My mother would feel it as disobedience. My father would feel it as trouble he must smooth with jokes and a wallet. They would come not with flowers, but with strategies, and I would have to decide whether the girl who learned to carry everyone's plates could put hers down without apology. For now, I am standing again in the kitchen where I make sense of what the heart refuses to explain, watching steam rise from a pot like a prayer that learned to be visible. I am 34, a woman whose hands have a memory louder than her past, and I am telling you this so I won't forget love that arrives late, and empty-handed is not love. It is nostalgia in a suit. I will not seed it anymore. I will cook for those who come hungry for what is real. The email I sent became more than a boundary. It became a spark. Within hours, my phone filled with replies that weren't really replies at all. They were declarations of war disguised as family etiquette. Ezra wrote first. Really? You're embarrassing yourself, Jules. Restaurants fail every day. Don't cut out the only people who'll pick you up when you crash. His words carried the same entitlement he'd worn since childhood, when every bad grade of his became my fault somehow for not helping him study. My mother's message arrived second, curt and theatrical. I'm ashamed of how ungrateful you've become. You should thank your brother for his stability instead of resenting it. This stunt proves why we couldn't celebrate you so selfish. That line, ashamed, ungrateful, selfish, echoed against every bone in me, because they were the same words she had used since I was a child who cried too easily, who cooked when I was supposed to be networking, who loved flavors more than numbers. By midnight, my father's voice reached me through a voicemail. He tried to laugh, smoothing his sentences the way he always did when trouble threatened to stain the family's polished surface. "Your mother's upset. Ezra's upset. Let's talk like adults, huh? You don't need to make ultimatums." I played the message 3 times, hearing not just his words, but the weight of all the silences he had built around my mother's sharpness. He wasn't asking me to soften. He was asking me to disappear again. And yet in the pit of my stomach I felt something steady. For the first time their words landed but didn't stick. I had spent too long auditioning for their approval, too long mistaking scraps for banquets. That night, lying awake on the cot in the tiny office of my restaurant, I promised myself something sacred. The family I built inside these walls would be chosen, not assigned by blood. But families, even false ones, don't surrender control easily. The next blow came not in words but in stars, or rather in the absence of them. By morning I saw the restaurant's online reviews sink. 1-star ratings appeared like bruises written in the same clipped tone I knew too well. Overpriced. Rude staff. Unseasoned food. Stay away. Some accounts had been created only days earlier, their only review about me. Clara, my cousin, had once bragged about how easy it was to manipulate Yelp. I could almost see her fingerprints on the keyboard. At first, I panicked. Reviews were oxygen for a new restaurant, and my dream felt like it was being strangled before it could breathe. But then the journalist who had been at opening night called. His voice held something sharp anger on my behalf. "Juliet, I don't know what's happening, but I was there. Your food was extraordinary. I'll be writing about it. Let them try to bury truth under lies, it won't last." And he was right. The article published 3 days later was titled, "The Restaurant That Family Forgot, But City Will Remember." People came not just to eat, but to bear witness. They wanted to taste the food of the woman who had cooked through absence, who had built flavor out of betrayal. Each table became a quiet rebellion, each reservation a vote against cruelty disguised as tradition. But even as customers filled the room, the corner table haunted me. I had reserved it in my heart for a family that never arrived, and sometimes I caught myself staring at it, imagining their faces rehearsing the lines I never got to deliver. That emptiness hurt more than the false reviews. You can fight lies with truth, but you can't fight absence with anything. And then unexpectedly, Natalie, Ezra's girlfriend, slipped into the restaurant one night after closing. She looked nervous, eyes darting as if my family might be hiding in the shadows to drag her back. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and showed me the evident screenshots of a group chat my family plotting how to discredit me. "If the restaurant fails, she'll come crawling back," my mother had written. Ezra had added, "She always does." Clara had laughed in emojis. Natalie's voice shook. "I couldn't be part of this anymore. You deserve to know." I stared at the screen, a surreal calm wrapping around me. Betrayal wasn't hidden in whispers anymore. It was spelled out pixel by pixel, undeniable. For years, I had been gaslit into believing I was dramatic, sensitive, imagining slights. But here, it was proof that the cruelty had always been deliberate, always orchestrated. I thanked her, and for the first time in years I felt light, not because their betrayal hurt less, but because now I knew I had never been wrong to feel it. The question remained, what would I do with this truth? Would I confront them? Expose them publicly? Or would I finally learn that revenge isn't always fire? It can be the refusal to burn at all. Natalie's screenshots burned in my mind long after she left. I scrolled through them over and over, each line cutting deeper than the last. "She'll never survive without us. Let's tank her reviews before she embarrasses the family further. If she loses the restaurant, maybe she'll finally listen." They weren't just cruel, they were deliberate. My entire life, I had carried this gnawing suspicion that my family's love was conditional, that their support was only scaffolding built to keep me in their shadow. Now it was undeniable. They hadn't just forgotten me on my big night, they had strategized my downfall. I should have felt rage, and for a moment I did. My hands trembled, my chest ached, and I wanted to scream until the walls cracked. But beneath the rage, another emotion quietly rose: vindication. For years, they'd told me I was too dramatic, too sensitive, imagining slights that weren't there. But the evidence glowed on that screen like gospel. I hadn't been wrong all these years. I had been right. The next morning, I sat at the corner table, the one I had saved for them on opening night, and spread out the screenshots printed and underlined. Mina, my sous chef, sat across from me, her brow furrowed. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I thought of my customers, of the critic who had written that my food tasted like defiance wrapped in saffron, of the couple who had told me my roast chicken felt like home. This restaurant wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who had been silenced, dismissed, forgotten. I couldn't let my family's poison seep into these walls. So I made a decision: I wouldn't fight them in the shadows where they thrived. I would expose them in the light. That week, a local journalist returned for a follow-up piece. When he asked how I was handling the surge of one-star reviews, I didn't hide. I handed him the printed screenshots. I told him about the group chat, about years of belittlement, about the grand opening they had skipped. He listened, eyes widening, his recorder catching every tremor in my voice. The article came out under the headline, "When Family Betrays the Chef Who Rose from Ashes of Her Own Bloodline." It was raw, unflinching, and it hit the city like a thunderclap. People didn't just come to eat anymore, they came to stand with me. Strangers left flowers. Regulars tipped double. Reviews poured in, not just about the food, but about resilience, about survival. And then came the silence from my family. No more texts, no more calls. For weeks it was as if they had vanished, licking their wounds behind closed doors. Until one night, Ezra showed up. He stood in the doorway of my restaurant. His tie loosened, his eyes tired in a way I had never seen before. "Juliet," he said, his voice lower than I remembered. "We need to talk." I froze. The staff watched from the kitchen, ready to step in. I gestured to the corner table, the one that had always been waiting. He sat. For the first time in my life, Ezra looked small. "I didn't think you'd go public," he muttered, staring at his hands. "It's humiliating." I leaned forward. "So was being your sister. So was being erased every time you walked into a room. But this time, you don't get to define the story." He flinched. Silence stretched between us, heavy as cast iron. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't think you'd make it without us." The words landed like ash on my tongue. I almost laughed. "I didn't make it without you. I made it despite you." Ezra left without finishing his drink. He didn't apologize, but he didn't threaten either. And that in my family was the closest thing to surrender I had ever seen. That night, I locked up and stood alone in the dining room. The air smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary, of citrus zest cooling in jars. I thought of my mother's voice, my father's excuses, Clara's smirk. For the first time, they felt like background noise, not the soundtrack of my life. I ran my fingers along the edge of the corner table, the wood smooth beneath my touch. "This seat is no longer for them," I whispered. "It's for me." And in that moment, I knew betrayal had broken me, but it had also remade me. Stronger, sharper, hungrier. In the weeks after Ezra's visit, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for their approval or bracing for their disappointment. I was simply living, and in that living, the restaurant bloomed. Word spread beyond the city. Food bloggers came with their cameras, capturing every detail from the saffron broth to the charred lemon garnishes. A travel magazine listed my place as a must-visit hidden gem. Tourists began making reservations weeks in advance. I had to hire more staff, expand the wine list, and even consider a second location. But what struck me most wasn't the success, it was the sense of belonging. Strangers who had read my story would come up to me after their meals, sometimes with tears in their eyes, and say, "Your fight feels like mine. You made me believe I can stand up too." They weren't just customers, they were witnesses. And I was no longer invisible. Still, old wounds don't vanish overnight. Some nights I'd lie awake replaying Ezra's words, "I didn't think you'd make it without us." It stung because beneath the arrogance was an admission they never believed in me at all. My childhood flashed back in fragments, my mother bragging about Ezra's grades while ignoring my art contest ribbons. My father patting my head absent-mindedly, as if I were a pet instead of a daughter, family dinners, where my voice was drowned out before I even opened my mouth. But those memories didn't break me anymore. They fueled me. Each forgotten moment was a reason I had built this restaurant brick by brick, plate by plate, love by love. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Natalie again, her voice shaky but determined. "Juliet, you need to know this. They're planning to sue you. Ezra, your parents. Clara, they're saying your story ruined their reputations." I felt the air punch out of my lungs. "Sue me for telling the truth." "Yes," she whispered. "They think if they drag you into court, you'll cave. They're desperate. And Juliet, they want to shut you down." For a moment, fear surged. Legal battles were expensive, exhausting. But then I remembered I wasn't alone anymore. I had a city behind me, loyal staff, customers who believed in my fight. I had the truth, and the truth, I realized, is the one ingredient you can't fake. So when the lawsuit came splashed across headlines, I didn't flinch. I stood tall. I told my lawyer, "Let's fight. Not just for me, for every person who's ever been silenced by their own blood." The courtroom smelled nothing like my kitchen. It was stale, sterile, buzzing with tension instead of flavor. My family sat across the aisle dressed in polished smiles and pressed suits, their eyes sharp with the hunger to win. My mother refused to look at me. Ezra smirked like he already owned the verdict. My father tapped his pen against the table, a rhythm of nerves he thought no one noticed. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and let the silence linger. Then I told my story, every jagged edge of it. I spoke of opening night, of empty chairs, of one-star reviews, planted by people who shared my blood. I described the screenshots Natalie had shown me, the proof of betrayal typed in their own words. My voice cracked, but did not break. The judge listened, the jury listened, and for once the world wasn't tilted in their favor. After days of arguments, evidence, and tension thick as caramel left too long on the stove, the verdict came, case dismissed. Their claims had no weight against the truth. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward me. Reporters asked how I felt, what I would do next. I smiled, not the polite smile I'd practiced for years, but a real one born of survival. "I'm going back to work," I said, "because I built something worth protecting, and no one, not even family, gets to take it away." The crowd applauded. Strangers hugged me. And for the first time, I realized the family I had always longed for might not be the one I was born into, but the one I had created, plate by plate, truth by truth, choice by choice. That night back at the restaurant, I lit a single candle at the corner table. Not for them, for me. For the girl who had once been invisible, and for the woman who had learned to be seen. And as I stood in that warm glow, I whispered to myself the words I had been starving to hear my whole life. "You are enough." The night after the trial, when the restaurant reopened, the air was electric. People lined up outside before we unlocked the doors, as if they wanted to be part of something bigger than food, part of a story that had clawed its way into light. Mina placed her hand on my shoulder. Before service began, her eyes shining. "Tonight we cook, not just for them," she said, gesturing toward the line, "but for you." She was right. For once, I wasn't cooking to prove my worth to anyone. I was cooking because it was the truest language I knew. When the tickets began rolling in, I felt weightless, as though every dish that left the pass was a declaration: I am here. I am strong. I am mine. The corner table once haunted finally filled that night. Not with my parents, not with Ezra or Clara, but with 4 women who had traveled from out of state just to eat at my restaurant. They asked for the Juliet special, and I improvised seared duck with a blood orange glaze plated with pomegranate seeds that looked like tiny jewels. When they took their first bites, one of them closed her eyes and whispered, "This tastes like healing." I excused myself to the back and let the tears fall silent and hot. Not because I was sad, but because the emptiness that had stalked me for so long was finally being filled, not by the family I had been born into, but by the family I had chosen. Weeks turned into months, and the restaurant thrived. A second location was announced this time, a smaller bistro near the waterfront, a place meant for late-night laughter and shared desserts. Investors reached out, but I chose carefully refusing to ever again hand control of my life to people who didn't respect it. One afternoon, while I was finalizing the design plans, Natalie came to see me again. She looked freer, her hair cut shorter, her smile brighter. "I left him," she said simply. "Ezra. I couldn't stay with someone who built his life on someone else's ashes." I hugged her. It felt like closing a door and opening a window at the same time. But just when I thought the past was finally behind me, I saw her, my mother. She showed up on a rainy Wednesday, her umbrella dripping onto the tiles, her pearls still perfectly in place. She asked for a table, alone. My staff froze, glancing at me for direction. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. I walked up to her slowly, my heart pounding. She looked older than I remembered, lines carved deep into her face, but her eyes were still the same sharp, calculating. "Juliet," she said, her voice calm. "You've made quite a name for yourself." I nodded. "I did, without you." Something flickered in her expression, hurt. Or maybe just surprise at hearing me say the words aloud. She glanced around at the packed room, at the walls humming with energy, at the staff who moved like they belonged to something greater than themselves. "I misjudged you," she admitted, her lips tightening. "I didn't think you had this in you." Her words, meant as a confession, felt hollow, because even in her admission there was no apology, just the same disbelief that I had managed to rise where she expected me to fall. I looked her straight in the eye. "You don't get to sit at this table, not anymore." Gasps rippled through the staff, but my mother didn't argue. She straightened her shoulders, gathered her umbrella, and left without another word. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through my bones. I stood there for a long moment, steadying my breath. Then I returned to the kitchen, lifted a pan, and seared a piece of salmon until the skin crackled like fire. Each sizzle was a reminder I had reclaimed my story, my worth, my life. That night, after the last guest left and the lights dimmed, I sat once more at the corner table. The candle flickered, reflecting in the window, and for the first time I didn't imagine them sitting across from me. I imagined myself young Juliet, the girl who cooked in secret, who dreamed in flavors no one cared to taste. I wanted to tell her we made it. They didn't destroy us, we're finally free. And maybe she heard me. Because in that quiet moment, the heaviness I had carried for decades finally lifted. This was the ending I never thought I'd earn, not a family's applause, but my own peace. If you've ever been betrayed, dismissed, or told you'd never make it, let my story remind you sometimes family isn't who you're born to. It's who shows up, who believes, who stays. And sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's living so fully they can't touch you anymore. If my story touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you could like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Not just to support me, but to help others who feel invisible find the strength to be seen. Because no matter who has walked away from you, your light is still yours.